Hey guys, Sierra Bailey here with Accel Commercial Real Estate. The video you're watching ties into our event in June, Accelerate. If you want to learn more about what you see today, scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the description to get your tickets now before early bird pricing runs out. Enjoy the video.
So I'm going to now talk about, we're learning online questions. I'm sorry, I should have asked. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about evictions because everybody listening here is either a property owner or would like to be a property owner. And anytime you're an owner of property with somebody else living in it, there's always a potential for evictions. And 2021 has been the most unique year in all the history of man for landlord-tenant law. Never have there been so many changes so quickly, so arbitrarily imposed on landlords as we've had in 2021. So kind of a brief history. So March 2019, the pandemic hits, and a lot of states start going into, well, gee, what do you do with these tenants now that can't afford to pay their rent because we've shut down their businesses? So there's a lot of moratoriums that go into effect. There's federal moratoriums, and then each individual state does some of their own moratorium. So on the federal level, we have the CARES Act. That has expired, so we no longer need to worry about the CARES Act, but we have the CDC moratorium that went into effect. CDC moratorium applies to all residential property. So it doesn't generally apply to commercial property, hotels, Airbnbs, but we're talking about single family homes, apartments, condos, people where actually they live and they plan on living for some time. So the CDC moratorium goes into effect. It's issued by the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under what I would consider to be a very broad reading of the statute. The statute that the Secretary relied upon basically said that the Secretary has the ability to kill animals, spray pesticides, and manage contagions in order to prevent the spread of disease, and other necessary measures. And what the CDC or what the Director of Housing and Urban Development decided, well, gee, other necessary measures means we can't have a bunch of tenants roaming the street looking for a place to live. So other necessary measures includes that. 3 federal courts have struck that CDC statute down. So when we talk about landlord-tenant law, the federal CDC moratorium is kind of this umbrella over everything, but each state has its own individual law. So California's landlord-tenant laws, very, very different from Tennessee. So right now in Tennessee, the CDC moratorium only applies in Middle Tennessee and Eastern Tennessee. Federal judge in Western Tennessee, Memphis, struck down the CDC moratorium as unconstitutional. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that. So if you're in Western Tennessee, then you don't have to worry about the CDC moratorium. You're strictly under Tennessee state law. California passed their own landlord-tenant laws. And what the CDC moratorium says is if a state passes laws that are more restrictive than the CDC moratorium, then the CDC moratorium doesn't apply. And no big shock, California passed laws that were more restrictive than the CDC moratorium. So that's why it doesn't apply there, because California laws are very, very restrictive on what landlords can do. So within Tennessee, so now let's even just get rid of the CDC moratorium, talk about Tennessee landlord-tenant law in general. Even in Tennessee, though, each individual county has different laws that apply, because the Uniform Tenant Act that's passed in Tennessee only applies to certain counties. So if you own property, you want to make sure you get an attorney that knows which law applies in which county. Because if you're in Davidson County versus Blount County or Bedford County or Rutherford County, you could have different regulation and rules that apply there. So let's talk about Tennessee for a second. In Tennessee, if you want to do an eviction, there's usually some kind of notice that has to go to the tenant. Tennessee law does have a provision that if there's a waiver in the lease, then the tenant can waive that notice. But generally, there's a notice that has to be given to the tenant. That notice has to expire without the tenant's compliance. And then if the tenant hasn't complied, either by paying rent or fixing whatever the problem was or moving out, then you can proceed to unlawful detainer court. You file your warrant, sheriff serves it, you get a trial date, you go to trial, you win, and then the sheriff comes and does a lockout. Pretty straightforward in Tennessee. You just need to make sure your notice specifies the reason why you're doing the eviction and gives the tenant an appropriate time to cure. And this is where we get into the different counties, because there's different time periods that apply in different counties. So if you give a 3-day notice in Davidson County, that's not going to be sufficient. So you want to make sure that you're operating in the appropriate realm of law for the county that you're in. So Tennessee is pretty straightforward. From beginning to end, a Tennessee eviction should really take no more than 4 weeks, maybe 6. Sometimes depends on what the tenant does. The tenant can file bankruptcy. They can, file motions, but generally speaking, that's about how they go. California, I will touch on very briefly because I don't know how many people we have online from California. California is a dystopian nightmare when it comes to landlord-tenant law. And I won't even get into the history of what California did because it's all over the place. I mean, the most wild roller coaster you've ridden at Universal Orlando would not even compare to what California has done landlord-tenant wise. In California now, if you own property there, California's laws apply to all property, so commercial and residential. For the most part, there's some exceptions on the commercial side, but for the most part, I tell my clients just treat it as though it all applies because you're going to run into that. In California, the counties pass their own rules. So again, if you're in California, you want to make sure that that your attorney knows the rules that apply within that county. What California law said was, if the county rules are stricter, then this law doesn't apply. So LA County, most of your Southern California counties are going to be a little bit more restrictive. California, if you have somebody the only reason you can evict is for what's called just cause. So in Tennessee, you can still evict for no cause. If you have an end of lease, or you have a tenant you just want out on a month-to-month, you can still do that. California, you cannot. You have to have a reason. And the only reasons are non-payment of rent, damaging the property, you want to move into the property, or you're taking the property off the market. That's it. There's no other reason to evict. Non-payment of rent, you give the tenant a 15-day notice. That's 15 court days. So it doesn't include holidays, does not include weekends, so it ends up being about 3 weeks. And then if the tenant still doesn't comply, then you can go to court. Eviction in California take about 4 to 6 weeks from beginning to end if the tenant does nothing. So your fastest case scenario is 4 to 6 weeks to get possession. If they do fight it, it could be 8 to 10 weeks. And California did something that no other state did that I'm aware of, maybe New York did. But in California, when you give the tenant a notice, you have to give the tenant a COVID declaration. What this declaration says is, I've been impacted by COVID, I can't pay my rent, so therefore don't evict me. You have to provide all of that to the tenant. All the tenant has to do is this, and that's it. That eviction is done until June. You can do nothing else. Tenant doesn't have to pay you rent, tenant doesn't have to do anything. All they have to do is sign that piece of paper, and it's done. Now, they're supposed to pay 25% of the rent, but they don't have to pay that till June 30th. So they can sit in their property rent-free until June 30th. So if you own property in California, then you want to get an attorney there that knows what they're doing, because the laws there are just ridiculously complex, and it takes so much time to figure out what to do, which is why we have so many people calling us right now from California, because that's where we lived the majority of our life. We didn't move here until I was 41. And so we have just a ton of people that are coming here, a ton of people listening to the podcast. It's been ridiculous, the number of people trying to get out of California. I'm sure that Jan and Brian have seen it just in what they do. So that's estate planning. So now landlord-tenant, any questions on the landlord-tenant side? Be happy to answer.
Thanks for watching this video. If you like what you see, be sure to follow our Generational Wealth Learning series. On select Thursdays, we offer cutting-edge industry information that would normally cost thousands of dollars. And the best part, our education is absolutely free. If you register through our events page, you can join us live, either in person or over Zoom. In the meantime, like this video, comment down below, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a beat.